Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Well, today's show is a bit of a synchronicity, albeit a somewhat grim synchronicity. I had the intense experience over the last few weeks of finding out that a good friend of mine was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer and had only a few weeks to live. And she died last week. And I was sort of around during that process, and it was a really remarkable experience. I mean, on some level, one of the amazing things about death is that it's so extraordinary and terrifying and reality-shattering for those of us who go through it, whether we're friends and family or the people going through it. And yet it's completely ordinary. You know, it's as ordinary as whatever, you know, taking a dump or picking your nose or whatever. I mean, it's just part of, you know, it's absolutely intrinsic to reality. And so it's not that I want to tell a particular story that's not so different than everybody else's, but there was a few things about this particular process that stood out for me. One is that I spoke to my friend a day or two after she had gotten her prognosis of, 2 to 4 weeks to live. And she was 57, and she was incredibly clear and unafraid. It was clear to her that she had lived a good life, that it was a little shocking, but she was ready to go with it. She had no interest in attempting any last-minute interventions, which weren't really suggested in this case anyway. It was hopeless in that sense. And her grace, her ability to hold that space, to be curious about what was happening, to let the emotions rise when they did, but also to continue to celebrate her extraordinary number of friendships, really sparked the whole scene. So the whole scene around the deathbed, her family, her friends, the way her time was spent, how she went through her things, how she talked to people, was often joyous and certainly amazing. I mean, a life-transforming experience for me. I was supposed to go away on a Zen retreat, actually, and I decided to stay, and it ended up being way more sadhana than a typical Zen retreat, both in terms of being with her as she went through this process and watching the possibilities of being in that space in an upright, aware, awake, curious, embracing, loving manner, that it's no lie that we can do that. And now everybody who was around her, me and all the people who are around her, know that is possible, given the right circumstances. Obviously, some health conditions, or if you get hit by a bus, there's no options. But within the right circumstances, it is possible for ordinary people to be extraordinary in relationship to this moment that so many people fear, that so many people don't want to think about, that our culture doesn't want to think about, that we're struggling to find a way to talk about. And it's becoming increasingly clear in my life as I get older and people start to go that preparing for death, thinking about death, trying to encourage a healthier culture around death and dying is a really significant value for me at a point when so many values are up in the air, when so many truths are being questioned. We all still die. And in my mind, it's incredibly important to at least attempt to die and face death and dying with grace, curiosity, awakeness, and the kinds of qualities that my friend manifested. Now, I do think there is a change. I do really believe, and a lot of people have talked about this, that over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a slow but significant shift in American society towards more room for these kinds of discussions, particularly among those of us who are not in a particular religious tradition. Although Buddhism has its own kind of very interesting relationship with death and dying, a lot of hospices came out of Zen movements and Buddhist movements, as well as Christian churches and paths as well. But outside of those realms, I think there's more room. There's death clubs, there's conversations, there's meals that are organized where everybody's going to talk about death and dying. There's more resources, there's more writing, there's more books. And there's, a rise in green burial, questioning about what kinds of burial techniques can we have. Can we have open pyres? There's in Colorado, you can be burned out in the open. Pretty cool, and maybe horse-drawn hearses and Viking funerals are just around the corner. Although Viking funerals are actually not very historically accurate, but I do believe that we're really at a wonderful time to go into this question, not only because it's something that American culture has long needed to do, but that it provides a kind of clarifying focus at a time when things are so extraordinarily unclear, that we're still in bodies, that our loved ones are going to pass, that we are going to pass, and that it brings a certain, I don't want to say sobriety because that sounds too just sort of flat, but a certain way of grappling with our still human condition, and of course a human condition that is shared by every human being on the earth. Trump, ISIS, Putin, your best friend, whatever. So I'm hoping that with movies like Coco and books like the book we're going to be talking about today, that we really do start to make a shift in how we die. And indeed, the title of the book that we'll be talking about today is How to Die: An Ancient Guide to the End of Life, by Seneca the Younger. Some of you will be talking about who Seneca was and his Stoic philosophy and how that plays into the questions that he deals with in a very forthright manner. These are the kind of books I really love today. It's small, it's like a pocket book, but it's got a nice cover, hardback. It's not very long, nice big print, easy to read, and very intellectually satisfying. It's my kind of nonfiction book. And if you're into the Latin's there. And we're going to be talking with the editor and translator of How to Die, James Romm, who's the James Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College, a sadly shrinking field in the humanities. Classics. There's a great deal of gold in them there hills, and I'm glad he's still bringing it to us out here in the world. He's written on Seneca and other features of the ancient world before, and very happy to have him on Expanding Mind. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. So let's just start out with a little, who is Seneca? He's a fascinating character. He was around when some of the most famous and notorious Roman emperors were doing their thing. Let's give us a little snapshot of Seneca, and then maybe talk about what has made him enduringly fascinating for you and so many people in the history of the West.
Yes. Well, Seneca was both a politician and a philosopher, and that's part of what's so fascinating about him. He led the life of the mind. He studied Greek philosophy and adapted it for his Roman audience, specifically Stoicism, which was a Greek school that was imported into Rome in the 1st century A.D. when Seneca lived. So he had his intellectual life, but then he also entered politics as a young man, a 30-year-old. He became a senator under Caligula, the most notorious of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and survived to become the chief minister to Nero, who was also a very problematic figure in Roman politics. And he spent 15 years by Nero's side as his advisor and chief minister. So these two roles are very hard to reconcile, and Seneca was a very complex man, and that's why I find him such an interesting study.
Well, one of the things when I was reading up a little bit more about him for the show, and one of the fascinating things about him is how enduring he has been throughout the history of the West, both among Christians and humanists. Like everybody sort of saw something of themselves in him. from Tertullian, and then you get into the Middle Ages. He's still got some space in the in some Catholic thinkers, and then of course with the rise of humanism with Erasmus and later figures like Montaigne. And today, everyone from Buddhists to Tim Ferriss loves him. It's like there's something in Seneca that seems almost. He seems like, in some ways, one of the most enduring thinkers in the West in terms of there's at all these different phases of Western history, people have seen something in him that they could affirm that was still useful for them.
Yes, that's right. He's never been as popular as Marcus Aurelius, for example, or Plato, some of the other ancient philosophers that he himself was connected to. But he does have a very rich corpus. A lot of his work survives. A lot of it is very beautifully written. He was an extremely adept stylist and wordsmith. And then he also has a body of tragedies. We shouldn't neglect those. He wrote tragic drama in verse, as well as his philosophical works in prose. And many of those have survived, became very influential on Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's extraordinary guy, and of course one of the elements that you mentioned was his relationship to Stoicism, and I'd love to just hear a little bit about that. That's again one of these philosophical, let's call it a sensibility or current that remains very lively for many modern people in a way that a lot of other ancient philosophies, even Plato, in a way, is a little harder for the modern mind to wrap its head around in some ways, even despite the enormous influence on the whole philosophical tradition that comes out of that. There's something very kind of recognizable about Stoicism, and I'd be interested to hear how Seneca, what his particular sort of contribution or way of framing Stoic ideas was, let's say even in comparison with someone like Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations are, as you know, more well known as a source of spiritual solace, philosophical thought, and a kind of Stoic embrace of the limits and possibilities of existence. So how does Seneca fit into this kind of Stoic line in the ancient world?
So Stoicism took many different forms, and Seneca's form is one of the most diverse and wide-ranging. In fact, some of his ideas really aren't Stoic at all. He was willing to adapt strains of thought from Platonism, from Epicureanism. He's really quite a heterodox thinker. That can make him frustrating because he doesn't give you a party line, and he sometimes even contradicts himself. But in general terms, he brought Stoicism down to earth. Stoicism in the Greek world was a very high-minded philosophy. It had a strong theoretical component. One had to understand things about physics and about biology and mathematics. So it was really kind of an abstract philosophy, and he focused on the practical dimension, how it dictates everyday behavior, how one solves ethical problems. So he's much more pragmatic thinker than the people who preceded him, and probably more so than Marcus Aurelius also.
Now, was that heterodoxy, that kind of mixture of different influences, is that on display in his writings on death and dying? Is that a particular place where you can tease out these various influences, or was it another pragmatic expression of a Stoic way of approaching those questions?
Yes, his thinking about death is a great example of his refusal to take a party line. The Stoics had a theory of death, or a philosophy of death, and especially of suicide, you were allowed to commit suicide under certain very restrictive conditions. But Seneca took that much further and has numerous discussions of suicide, some of which make it seem almost like a virtue under any circumstances, and other discussions make it much more of an extreme measure. He seems to have had different thoughts about it at different times, and he allowed himself to follow those thoughts.
Yeah, well, let's go into the suicide ones, because that's in probably the most disarming parts of the book, where he's talking about the sort of the way in where he's celebrating the way in which suicide provides the opportunity for a kind of freedom, a kind of an ability to still be autonomous even in incredibly oppressive circumstances. So he has examples of slaves who hurtle their heads against the wall until their brains bash out, as an example of how even in these terribly oppressive circumstances there is some modicum of freedom provided by the possibility of suicide. And you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
What is it? Does suicide mean something different at that time? What are the existing Stoic ideas about suicide? And then why is that such an important theme for him? I mean, it's a significant thread in your book. It's one of the things that he talks about a lot. And what's going on with him with that particular concern?
Good. So the times in which he lived are definitely relevant to understanding his obsession with suicide. The emperors used to force people to commit suicide rather than execute them. It was a standard procedure as a way of dealing with political enemies, so that they would appear to have admitted their guilt in death, and their death would not be as much of a blot on the emperor's record. So routinely people were asked to open their veins, and soldiers would stand around to make sure that they did so, and then the victim would be allowed to pass on his property to his heirs. That was the carrot that the emperor used to enforce this system. So Seneca had witnessed a lot of suicides, and he himself eventually was forced to commit suicide by Nero, and that scene was recorded for us by Tacitus, and it forms the last chapter of my book, How to Die. So he was thinking a lot more about suicide than we typically do today, and he especially thought about it as a way to escape from oppression. The political system of his day had become an autocracy. The emperor had the power of life and death and virtually no checks on his power. And Caligula and Nero both became very cruel in their use of that power. So suicide became a means of escape for the political class to which he belonged, that was suffering from severe stress and oppression under the bad emperors.
Well, it may, it's one can't help read this material and want to try to pull contemporary value out of it. I think it's one of the interesting things about certain ancient philosophers, not just philosophers in general, is that you can read them historically. Oh, look, this is someone who's operating in this time and thinking these thoughts based on their time. But there's this kind of an inherent pragmatism where we want to go, okay, how does this help us clarify some of the things that we're wrestling with today? Because obviously, particularly with some Stoic thought, there are some real guideposts there. I'm curious, just in your own thinking, or becoming aware of some of the issues around end of life issues around assisted suicide today. The conflicts, on the one hand, concerns about the state being involved in the process of ending a life. on the one hand, on the other hand, the kind of ability to craft one's own demise and to exit the situation when it becomes intolerable, and to decide beforehand when that point of intolerability is and be able to choose to do that. And there's obviously some conflict there. And then you get into all the issues of, like, what is an end of life? What is a vegetative body? Brain death. Is brain death actually death? Not really. It's sort of death. But, there's a lot of these crazy, confusing, emotionally and charged issues around particularly assisted dying. Do you think that Seneca helps clarify things today? And if so, what are the aspects of his thought on suicide that seem relevant to us?
Yeah, well, you mentioned assisted suicide, which is being debated in many state legislatures now, and several states have actually adopted measures where someone who's terminally ill can sign a kind of declaration or can be vetted by doctors to make sure that they're making a sound decision, and then they're able to procure an easy death rather than suffer through to the last. And Seneca discusses that very case because he saw some friends who went through long, painful terminal illnesses, and he's actually rather undecided about whether one should take one's life in that situation. So he doesn't give us a clear path towards a policy of assisted suicide. But he does force one to think about all the ramifications, the trade-off between facing bravely whatever pain the illness has in store for you, being kind of, stoic with a small s, and determined to put up with any kind of discomfort, versus the courage that it takes to end one's own life. He weighed those two kinds of bravery in the balance, and he couldn't really make up his mind which was preferable. But
yeah, that's go ahead.
It's a very tricky matter. You talked about a case that you have experienced recently with one of your friends, and we've all experienced the death of friends or family at some time or other. My stepfather is an interesting case in point, where he suffered a stroke in his 80s, which left him largely paralyzed. And at the time when he had the stroke, and it became clear that he wasn't going to recover, he was sure that he was going to commit suicide within a matter of months. But he got used to the condition. He got a lot of joy out of the life that he had, which was basically just reading books. And he ended up living 7 years, and at the end would never have dreamed of shortening his life. So it's hard to assess, from a distance or when we're healthy, what it will actually feel like to be in a dire illness or be greatly debilitated. We may think that that's a situation that calls for an early exit, but when we get there, it may not be that way.
Yeah, and not even just because we have fear. I mean, that was something that opened my eyes, thinking about the exact scenario you're talking about how the criteria is going to change based on your changing capacities and your changing experience of the world. And I think before I had sort of maybe an idea that was, you're just basically going to be afraid, and so you're going to hold on as long as you possibly can. But I think that's much too simplistic. That part of the changing criteria is recognizing that one can have a rich life within very constrained circumstances, being bedridden or spending a lot of time out of it or whatever it is. That there is just something, inherently precious about being of consciousness, of experiencing life, and so even in very limited situations. So it sort of throws all of our axioms, and that's partly why externally defined definitions of death or when death should be affected are very hard to really stand on. So it's quite a shift. Another thing that came up with my friend, that's also something that struck me in reading How to Die in reading Seneca, is the importance he places on modeling your behavior as a moral or ethical model for others. And that is something that, in a way, is some of the most basic elements of ethics, and it's something that is really kind of far from a lot of contemporary ideas, even arguments about what is ethical. They're often about what you do or don't do. But there's something about the ability to sort of like model courage in the face of death. Like one of the philosophical reasons to be courageous in the face of death is not just to honor yourself and honor your own capacities to look at this stuff head on, but to model this for others to see that. And that was what was so extraordinary about my friend's passing, that I had completely not expected, was she was really so remarkable that it changed everybody and everything there. And now we all kind of know that you can do that. You can be that way in the right circumstances. For Seneca, what is it about that aspect of moral behavior that you're actually showing? You're kind of encouraging people, almost seducing people into the philosophical life. That is a very interesting aspect to what he's up to. Yes.
He has a gallery of heroic deaths that are each meant to show us a different kind of model of courage or cowardice, or of acceptance versus a kind of cowardly clinging on to life. And that's one of his best strategies as a writer, is to employ these very colorful, very vivid anecdotes of deaths or long lingering deaths or short violent deaths. He has all kinds of death. Sometimes it gets a little oppressive, but he's a good enough storyteller that he really captures our attention. One of my favorite ones is his story of Julius Caunus, who was a Roman centurion under Caligula, unjustly sentenced to die, and when the centurion came to take him to the executioner's block, he was playing at a board game with one of his fellow prisoners, and on leaving the room, he turned to the guard and said, "You're my witness. I was ahead by one." So disdainful of death that all he cared about was to have an accurate record that he was winning the game.
Well, that's interesting. You use that phrase disdain, and there's a kind of power that comes from disdaining death while not denying it, and that's a very interesting place to be. Where there's so much. I would say in general, America is a kind of death denial culture. It's always about expanding the self. You can get more. There's always pot of gold around the corner. You can, self-help never stops. We're like always sort of improving. That now we're seeing, the sort of the autumn years are becoming like populated with lots of images of, success and energy and sexuality and da da da. So it's like we're kind of, death denial culture in some ways, but accepting death doesn't just mean like kind of like somberly taking on the inevitable loss of everything that you love and everything that you know. That's part of the picture, sure. But there's also, once you sort of acknowledge that death is in the room all the time and has been since you were born, it's always sitting there, it's always in the room. There's a kind of relationship that develops that has in it something like disdain, or like, yeah, whatever, or okay, at some point, but I'm not going to let this determine what I do. I'm not going to act, let's say, out of fear of death exclusively. When you have an option where like the more moral thing to do or the more courageous or desirable thing to do involves a high risk of death versus not doing it, you don't want to not do it just because you're afraid of dying. So you want to have a kind of disdain there too. So it's this weird mixture of like that I sense in Seneca between respect and a kind of diffidence.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a personal thing, do you think, with him, or is it a philosophical position?
I think it's mostly a philosophical position. It's interesting that in his own life, he didn't choose to risk his life or to commit suicide at various points where he could have done a lot of good for Rome if he'd opposed Nero or if he'd spoken up frankly in the Senate, things that would have put him in jeopardy, he chose not to do. So he didn't exactly practice what he preached, but at the same time, he was a very powerful rhetorician, and he's able to convince us of how we should feel, even if he didn't set the best example himself.
Well, how do you deal with that difference there? I mean, some people look at Seneca and go, "Look, he's just a rhetorician. He's just a blowhard. He's just interested in politics and accruing wealth, and so he had a good line and people bought it." But look, if you actually look at he's a hypocrite. Is like that's the strong version of it. And at the same time, there's always something in philosophy and articulation and ethical discussions where we're positing ways of being that we recognize are good or worthwhile, and at the same time that we may not reach it. We may not reach it personally. The people listening to it may not be able to achieve that, but that doesn't mean it's not valid as a position or as a call. How do you see him in the end? You spend a lot of time with him. You've written a couple books about him. Is he a conflicted guy? Is he a bit of a hypocrite? Is he just doing his best? Is he someone who managed to channel wisdom that he was not himself always able to live up to? How do you see that tension in his life?
Yeah, I think your last formulation is a pretty good one. He was able to channel wisdom that he couldn't live up to. He is often compared to Socrates in the Greek world, and in fact, the only portrait bust that we have of Seneca is a double bust, which shows his head back to back with the head of Socrates. So someone was trying to compare the two when they carved the bust. He knew that he was an imperfect human being. He knew that he was not a sapiens, a wise man, which is the Stoic code word for a perfect master, someone who would always live by Stoic principles. He knew he was no Socrates, and he still managed to write very movingly of the aspiration to be a wise man. And there's something very moving about that. He recognized his own imperfections and still decided to try to express his highest ideals for others to follow.
And then how does this play out in what we know about his actual death? I mean, maybe you can talk about the political circumstances, and though it's at the one account is at the end of your book, but just what we know about that and how that maybe even just for you personally as someone who's been wrestling with this guy gives you an insight about him in terms of how he faced his own conscious suicide.
Yes, well, the link to Socrates is very clear there because he actually had stored up a quantity of hemlock, which is the same poison that Socrates took when he was condemned to death by the Athenians. It's a poison that numbs you and sort of paralyzes you, and that scene is played out in Plato's work, The Phaedo. We see Socrates actually growing numb and dying after drinking the hemlock, and his last words are that he owes a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, because his death was actually a kind of escape from his body and therefore a healing. So he thought he would be able to imitate that kind of death. In the end, he didn't, and his death got very messy and protracted, as it's described by Tacitus. It started when he was accused by Nero of taking part in a conspiracy against Nero's life, which was led partially by Seneca's nephew, a poet named Lucan. So Seneca was doubtless aware of it, but we can't say for sure that he did or didn't participate. It's very unclear. But he was linked to it by Nero, and the soldiers were sent to surround him and force him to take his own life. And he started off by slicing his veins open, which is interesting that he had the poison but chose first to do something much more painful and violent to himself. And his wife, interestingly, asked to commit suicide with him, and so she also opened her veins. And then, mysteriously, the blood didn't flow out fast enough to kill him, so he then asked for the poison and drank it, but that also didn't work. So after several hours of pain and suffering, he finally dragged himself into a hot steam room, a vapor bath, and suffocated to death.
Man, what an ordeal.
Yes, it was. It was quite an ordeal, and Tacitus presents it almost as a black comedy that, the guy just couldn't die after all his years of speculating about death and suicide. So it's played almost for grim humor. But I think that in the end he would have been happy with his death because he did suffer. He thought that suffering and death was a ennobling experience, that it brought you a kind of heroism. And it was entirely voluntary. The soldiers never intervened. So
what about the mysterious not taking the poison and going for the slicing the veins? Do you have any gut feelings on that one? That's an interesting move after all that preparation.
Yes, it is. Yeah, there too. I think that he saw the pain of the blade as a kind of nobility. One of his own personal heroes, whose death he describes numerous times in his writings, is a Roman senator who preceded him by about a century by the name of Cato. And Cato disemboweled himself in a very gruesome way after losing a major battle. And then when the doctors came and sewed him up and tried to save him, he ripped open the stitches and killed himself a second time, essentially. And Seneca describes that death very glowingly. So I think he wanted to suffer in a similar way, to show a similar kind of determination.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thinking about also, his attitudes, we have to see them in relationship to his understanding of how an individual human life fit into the larger cosmos. I mean, we always have a cosmology. There's no way out. If we're Christian, we think we're going to heaven or we'll be judged. If we're atheists, we think we just go into the earth and there's no consciousness. If we're Buddhists, that other things happen. There's always some kind of model of what happens next and how that then flows back and informs the way we look at death while we're still alive. What was his sort of view of the cosmos, and how did that influence his attitude towards death and dying?
Yes, so he talks several times about rejoining the universe, becoming the original particles from which you were formed, and having your matter rejoin the world of nature, which is a very Epicurean view. The other school that was popular this time was heavily focused on the idea of atoms being made up of atoms that are indestructible and therefore will just come back in some other form, in some other configuration. But he also occasionally talks about an afterlife. He doesn't reject the idea that the soul is immortal and that it might go to some otherworldly place after death. It might have consciousness, might be able to look down on the earth and see what's happening. He describes souls doing that in a couple of his works. So he's not totally out of tune with the Christian idea of heaven.
But he doesn't
idea.
really hold on to it, right? It's not like he's got a fixed idea of this is what happens to the soul.
No, he has no fixed idea. And he's sometimes very scientific about it, that it will simply be nothingness, and therefore we'll be in the same condition that we were before we were born, when we had no consciousness and no existence. But at other times he seems to talk about an afterlife. He wasn't dogmatic about it. The one thing he was sure about was that there was no hell, there was no place of punishment where the soul would be tortured. So there was nothing to fear from death. One would never experience it as a pain after death.
Right. That's the, in a way, the thing that's coming up right now. We have about 10 minutes left. Is that fearlessness? And again, it was something in my friend that it was really remarkable, and I've been spending a lot of time just thinking about, like, what was it in her life? What was it in her temperament? What was it in her understanding of the world, her experiences, the things she chose to focus on? Where can I find that fearlessness? Because even though I spend a lot of time thinking about this, probably more than your average bear, and have tried to bring a sense of courage to it, I can still be very terrified of these processes. I think most of us can relate with that. And so when you think about Seneca's fearlessness, to the degree that he actually had it and wasn't just presenting a good model, but that was part of his upright relationship with death. Where does that come from? Can you get there philosophically? Can people can you read this sort of arguments for why you should not have fear? You're just going to go back to the place you came from anywhere. That happens to everybody. All the kinds of arguments that are laid out very clearly and concisely in the way that you've edited this. Do you think that can work? That we can become fearless that way, or is it almost more of a temperamental thing? Like some people are just terrified, some people are courageous. What do you think?
I'm not sure what I think about that. I think there is an element of temperament in it, but Seneca certainly believed that we could use our reason to convince ourselves not to be afraid, and we could rehearse certain arguments, and we could accustom ourselves to the idea of death. We could study death, as he puts it, and just get more familiar with it so that it's not so terrifying. So I think it's a mixture of the two. Like there's probably certain natural limits to what one can achieve based on one's nature, but within those limits, one can make progress towards the kind of serenity that Seneca is urging on us.
Yeah, and it seems to me that that's where studying death is something that we can do. That's something that even if we don't know where the outcome will be, either for us or we do not necessarily have a goal, we can invite those questions into our lives. And when we have no choice but to look at it, especially with friends and family, and then ultimately our own situation, which is always the case, that by inviting those questions in, it feels like just that familiarity alone shifts the story somewhat. That even if we can't achieve fearlessness, or we can't achieve another call you have there is to have no regrets. If you go early, you go early. It's not that long, no matter how you slice it. Quality is better than quantity, which is a very important thing for us to think about. That's one thing we didn't really talk about. Is he's very clear on thinking in terms of the quality of life versus the quantity of life, and how crass and kind of ignorant it is to think of it in terms of quantity. And yet the kinds of choices that so many people face at the end of their lives is like trading quality for quantity as promised by this massive medical machine that, by the way, is also extracting all of your resources as it's doing this. And you're dealing with your family just at the point when you're realizing that you could actually maybe help them by not spending all your savings to extend your a kind of crappy life for another month, maybe. And tons of people are in that question all the time. And that was another place where I was like, yeah, we could hear some some Seneca lore here too,
Yeah.
But because all this stuff is there, we really got to look at it.
Yes, indeed. People used to, in the Renaissance, keep skulls on their desks and their bureaus. It was like you wanted to just constantly remind yourself that that's where you're going. But we don't do that anymore. We want to shield ourselves and keep death in the hospice ward and let the doctors and nurses deal with it. So, we live in a different kind of society, and denial of death is very strong.
When you teach this stuff, do you kind of approach the classroom situation as a way to really grapple with the issues directly, rather than there's always the tendency as scholarship to put things in historical context. You show how the thinker relates to other thinkers. You sort of analyze the complexities, and that's all fascinating stuff. It's delicious. I love history. I love these questions, but sometimes it can be a way to avoid the capacity of the text before us to ask us directly and to engage us philosophically and existentially where we sit. I'm curious whether, obviously, by putting out a book like this, you believe that that's true for Seneca, that these things can speak directly to us, to broader readerships. But I'm curious whether you bring that into the classroom.
Yes, I do actually, and I'm fortunate to teach at Bard, which is a very intuitive institution. It likes to talk to the gut of the students and relate things to their own lives. It's not a very abstract sort of ivory tower institution. So we have a program in which we read these philosophical works, and they really are practical philosophy. We try to use them as a guide to the good life.
It's actually kind of ironic. It seems like, there's always been a sort of a little place for, how ancient wisdom can, inform your life today. It's always been part of modernity, that kind of looking back. But it does seem that there's more space now, that there actually is room in the popular world for a kind of re-engagement, with these thinkers, or both philosophically in terms of science, et cetera. But the irony then is the fact that classics departments, that the actual, capital S scholarship around classics, are being hit as hard as any branch of the humanities. So it seems to be there's a weird question that culture-wide we're asking, just outside, both inside and outside the university, of what is the value of continuing to pay attention to these things that were written thousands of years ago. How do you see that working now? How do you see the role of classics changing, or what's your hopeful scenario for how we can still be informed culture-wide by some of these thinkers and histories?
Well, the kind of message that Seneca is sending is probably more at home in a philosophy program than classics per se. I I teach Seneca as a language teacher. I teach him in Latin and try to get my students reading him in the original. But I think philosophy has as big a role to play as classics in bringing these texts into our modern world. Classics is under the opprobrium in the modern institution of being about dead white males, and this is a topic for another discussion. But our future is getting dimmer by the day because of identity politics in education, and students wanting to study things from their own background or from their own ethnic or racial group. And unfortunately, the Greeks and Romans don't correspond to anyone's ideas about their identity. What I like about the classics is that it transcends those issues. It's universal, and or at least for the West, it's universal, and we all share in it equally because none of us are ancient Greeks or Romans.
That's certainly the case. What else do you see yourself doing in relation to art? Are you working on more books that will go out to a popular audience?
Yes, indeed. I have another volume in this same series that How to Die came out in, called How to Manage Anger, which is also from Seneca, from a work of his called De Ira, about anger, and it's practical philosophy from the Stoic tradition about how to keep yourself from getting destroyed by rage. Certainly a very timely issue for our politics today. And down the road, I have a third one that may come out in the same series about generosity, how to give and receive. So Seneca's a wealth of these sort of issues, practical, ethical issues.
And do you sense that there's more hunger for these kinds of pragmatic philosophical reflections in terms of people's readers, demand, reviews? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes, I think there is. You see it in the huge demand for Marcus Aurelius. His Meditations is almost always the top-selling book from the ancient world on Amazon, and people look to him as a guide to life because he was in the political world. He was a real person dealing with real problems, and yet looking for a spiritual dimension to the problems he faced. And Stoicism has been revived as a living philosophy. So I think that the modern West has become disillusioned with a lot of the things that we thought that we wanted. Material prosperity hasn't made us happy. Unlimited freedom hasn't made us happy. So I think we're looking for other ways to find happiness.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, and I think you've done a fine job of providing some alternatives. How to Die: An Ancient Guide to the End of Life by Seneca, edited and translated by James Romm, out on Princeton University Press. A fine item, and I look forward to how to deal with anger. Again, a very timely topic. It's funny how these basic human things are timely. So, James, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Great. All right, folks, until next week, keep your minds open.